Welcome to AHDB Agronomy Week 2020. The live stream session will start shortly. Before we begin, we wanted to remind you of a few points of housekeeping. You're all on mute, so don't worry, we can't hear you. The session is scheduled to last between 1 and 1.5 hours, including questions. We want this session to be as interactive as possible, so please post your questions throughout the session using the live Q&A function in the Agronomy Week platform below. We're recording this session, so if you miss anything or would like to watch it again, it will be available on the AHDB YouTube channel and AHDB website. You can also come back and watch the recordings on the Agronomy Week platform for 3 months. At the end of the session, we'll provide you with unique BASIS and Naroso codes. Don't forget to complete the BASIS and Naroso forms using the relevant tabs on the platform. You have 2 weeks after the live session to register for your points. Join in the conversation online. Follow AHDB_cereals and AHDB_potatoes on Twitter and use the hashtag AgronomyWeek. If you have any issues with the conference platform, there are digital event FAQs in the menu on the left-hand side. You can use the Help tab to contact the team if you experience any technical problems during the week. We hope that you enjoy Agronomy Week 2020. Thanks for joining us. Your session will now start.
Good morning and welcome to day 2 of Agronomy Week 2020. My name is Fiona Geary and I work in Knowledge Transfer for Cereals and Oilseeds, which is part of the Arable Knowledge Exchange team. And I'll be hosting the session this morning. So today's session is focused on cereals and oilseeds varieties, in particular using the recommended list to make decisions on farm. As part of the Agronomist Induction, you will have received an email a few weeks ago from Paul Gosling, who is one of our speakers this morning. And that email contains some background to the recommended list, as well as some useful links and resources. The recommended list is available online and as a hard copy publication. But as busy agronomists, you may prefer to have the information more readily available to you, which is why AHDB have developed the recommended list app. So this is a free app and it works offline. It's got the most up-to-date data and it has the functionality for you to be able to make notes and bookmark any varieties that you find yourself referencing most often. So to get the best out of today's session, I would encourage you to download that app, which you can do by clicking the link in the useful links section of this webpage or by visiting ahdb.org.uk/RL app. So you can download the app and then you can use it as a reference point throughout the session this morning. Also below the video, you will find today's programme and you will see that we will start with Paul Gosling, who manages the recommended list programme, and he will talk about the background and give us some information on the trials and how best to get the most out of the recommended list on farm. We'll then pass over to Catherine Harris, who is AHDB's crop disease expert, and she will focus on the disease scoring element of the recommended list and how this knowledge can help you as agronomists in practice. Like all of the sessions this week, it's a great opportunity to ask any questions that you may have. All of the questions are anonymous, so if you would like to post them at any point, there's plenty of opportunity this morning for discussion and to ask Catherine and Paul any questions that you may have. So please use this opportunity. And like yesterday, today's polls can be accessed by clicking the link just below the video. This will open a new tab and you'll be prompted to enter your name. This is just so that you can enter the poll. Your name doesn't show anywhere, so don't worry about that. And I would encourage you to really partake in the interactive element of Catherine's session later on. So that brings us to our first speaker, Paul Gosling, who is the recommended list manager at AHDB. So over to you, Paul.
Thanks, Fiona. So yes, I will be talking about I'll give you an introduction to the recommended list, a little bit of the background about how it works, so you can understand what the numbers mean a little more, a little bit more about how to use the actual resources available. And then Catherine will talk over the disease part of the RL. Also, disease is an important factor when you're selecting varieties and indeed managing varieties. So I've asked the question, what has the recommended list ever done for us? Or perhaps I should have said, what has it ever done for agronomists? There are plenty of places you can go and find information about varieties. You can see breeder trials. If you're a member of a large company, you probably have your own trials. There are lots of places you can find information about varieties. So why recommended list? Well, in 2020, we asked an independent consultancy company to review the recommended list to make sure it was still getting value for money for levy payers. And one thing they did was they went and asked agronomists. They mostly asked agronomists what they thought of the RL and how important it was for making variety selections for their customers. And I've put on here a couple of quotes that I pulled out of that report. And the first one says, RLs do what they're supposed to do. They're a very good tool of information commercially for us. The most important aspect is the independent trials. And that is a very important factor when you think about the recommended lists. The trials are independent. We trial the varieties side by side in a completely open and fair way, so that you know exactly how the varieties will perform. We're not trying to promote anyone's varieties over anyone else's. And the second quote there is, overall, we want an equitable, validated system with clear protocols, and that's exactly what you get with the RL. And you do. If you want to see the protocols we run the trials by, you can see those on our website. You can see exactly how the varieties are selected. All that information is there, so it's an open and clear process. It may not be exactly the process that everyone wants, but it's open and clear and agreed by everyone. And finally, at the bottom there, the report stated that agronomists in their survey found that the recommended list was at least as important and valuable for their clients as all the other sources of varietal information put together. So yes, there are lots of other sources of information out there, but the recommended list is really important, and as agronomists, you should always have a copy either in your back pocket on the app or as a solid publication. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the recommended list system, how to use the recommended lists, and then Catherine will talk about how the disease ratings are calculated and how to use them. So what is the purpose of the recommended list? Well, the recommended list has two real purposes. The main one is to identify new varieties, and we do focus very much on new varieties, which have a balance of features that can make them better than the existing varieties, so they could potentially provide a greater economic return to the market. Farmers aren't likely to change their varieties unless there's something better on the market, and so we are looking for something better. And we always want to be driving varieties forwards, getting better disease resistance, better yields, better quality, and that's what the recommended list is about. We also have a secondary task, and that's to make sure that the supply chain has sufficient grain of the correct quality and consistency, because big processors such as maltsters and millers are also levy payers. It's important that we have the right sort of varieties going in to those supply chains. So the recommended list structure looks something like this. We have AHDB, we then have BSPB, the British Society of Plant Breeders, and they represent the plant breeders within the recommended list structure, MAGB, which are the maltsters, and NABIM, who are the millers. Overseeing the whole of the RL project is an RL project board, and then below that we have 3 crop committees, each for the different groups of crops. And those crop committees are made up of agronomists, of growers, of technical experts, and representatives of the breeders. And they make all the decisions on which varieties are recommended. AHDB play no part in the actual selection of varieties. I know that competition is an open competition to sit on those committees, and maybe in future years you'll find yourself sitting on one of those committees as an agronomist, or maybe as a grower even, and selecting the varieties of the future. As well as the committees, we have the AHDB team, and we're divided into 2. We've got the field or technical team, and they're all based out of Huntingdon near Cambridge, and they're responsible for inspecting all the trials, not only our RL trials, but the statutory national list trials, and they ensure those trials are fit for purpose. They also validate the data coming in from the trials, again, to make sure it's suitable for making selections. And they also run the trials program. They liaise with our trial operators. All our trials are done by contractors. We don't run the trials ourselves. We then have a data team, which is Stoneleigh based. They receive and collate all the data coming in from the trials, and they analyse the data, producing the reports for the committees, which the committees then use to make their variety selections. And the data team are also responsible for producing all the publications. As backup, we have consultant statisticians. We use some fairly sophisticated statistics in the RL, and that's Biostatistics Scotland. And we also have backup from consultant pathologists over at NIAB. The recommended list is a cycle. It just goes round and round in circles every year. Starting in May, the committees have their separate planning meetings, and they select the criteria which they'll use for sowing and recommending varieties at the coming meetings. Then in August, we have our resowing and candidate selection meetings. Here we identify the varieties which we want to resow, we think have got a future, and before we move into the recommendation meeting. We then move into recommendation in November when we consider which varieties to add to the recommended list, and also decide which varieties to take off the recommended list. And then that cycle just goes round and round every year. And this is what the system looks like, just to give you an idea of what we're dealing with. We call this the pyramid of selection, and the numbers here are a couple of years old, but they're very relevant, and I've selected winter wheat because the numbers look really big. But we have a similar situation with all the crops. Obviously, with crops like oat, for example, you have a small number of varieties. Wheat and oilseed varieties are very large. And overall, we have 11 crops between our recommended and described lists, with around 400 trials, nearer 450 trials every year, and over 42,000 plots. And those trials are all inspected by our trials team. So right at the top, we start with the breeders doing their crosses, producing their different breeding lines, which might potentially become varieties. And in wheat, we're talking about 800 a year. They then select the best of those lines to potentially become new varieties, and they enter them into national list year one trials. In order for a variety to be sold and marketed as seed in the UK, it needs to be on a national list. And in order to get on the national list, you have to pass some tests to prove that you're a unique variety, and also that you can offer some benefit to the agricultural industry. At the end of the first year of national listing, the breeders will select the best of those ones to go into year two national listing. And at the end of the year two, the breeders allow us to see this data. The data that comes out of these trials is their data, it's not ours. But as part of the RL consortium, they allow us to see this data, and the crop committees will use that data to select the best of these national list varieties to go into our first year of recommended list trials. And then at the end of the first year of recommended list trials, we've got 3 years of data, 2 years of national list, 1 year of recommended list trials, and the committees use that to select the varieties to go onto the recommended list. So we start in wheat with about 800 lines up here. We'll end up with perhaps 5 or 6, 7 varieties being added to the recommended list each year. So it's a big filtering process to get down to these last few varieties. In terms of the trials themselves, the trials are generally held where you'd expect them to be based on crop area. So for wheat, they're in the eastern part of England, lots in East Anglia, big wheat growing area, exactly where you'd expect them to be. We also do have wheat trials further west. They do grow wheat in the west, and also it gives us an opportunity to put the varieties under a bit more stress, particularly in terms of disease, than you'd get in East Anglia. We even have a trial in Southern Ireland. They get incredible levels of septoria in Southern Ireland, and that allows us to really see how the varieties perform under high disease pressure from septoria. And we actually have some varieties over in Germany, because in Germany they get high levels and consistent levels of fusarium, much more so than we do in the UK, so we can put other varieties under severe tests against fusarium. And for other crops, the distribution is different. So in Scotland, for instance, for spring barley, for instance, we have a lot more trials in Scotland relative to England, and that's because spring barley is a very important crop in Scotland compared with England. So the recommended list sometimes gets criticised for focusing too much on yield. People sometimes say that yield is everything, and the recommended list hasn't really moved with the times. And yield is very important. Growers want to grow varieties that are going to yield well. And so we do order our varieties for each market segment. So for instance, group 3 wheats, we would order them in UK yield variety, and then we set a yield target for recommendation. That yield target is generally the highest yielding variety currently on the recommended list. And if a new variety is more than 2% above that yield target, it gets automatically added to the recommended list, but only if it meets minimum standards and specification. If it doesn't, it has to be reviewed. For varieties that are between the yield target and this 2% level, we review them, but we do expect to recommend those varieties because they're offering a benefit to the industry. They have better yield than what's currently available. But if that variety has a weakness, we may not recommend it. Below the yield target, we always review varieties, and the expectation is not to recommend unless they have a strength. If you get more than 2% below that yield target, then the variety really has to have some exceptional strengths in order to be recommended. What sort of do I mean when I'm talking about strengths? Well, we use what we call comparative varieties. So we assess yield using this, and then we pick comparative varieties, which are varieties with good agronomics, good quality, with which to compare the strengths of a variety. So it may not have the yield, but if it looks better than our comparative varieties, better on agronomy, better on quality, a variety can get recommended. And the strengths could be in disease resistance, crop quality, aspects of agronomy, or we'd like to think a combination of more than one of those. And what are the strengths we actually assess varieties on, apart from yield? Well, this is one of our tables out of our crop committee handbook, which guides the way the committee should select varieties. This is for wheat. As you'd expect, we've got different criteria for different groups of wheat. So bread making wheat, biscuit making, and then feed varieties. And we've got different categories. There's not quite all of them on here, but most of them on here, by which we judge varieties. And the importance of those will vary depending on the group we're talking about. So as you'd imagine, miller's assessment is very high importance for judging milling wheats, bread making wheats, but of low importance for group 4s. Different agronomic features are weighted differently depending on how important they are. So lodging with PGI is very important because no one wants to see crops going over, whereas height is actually quite considered of low importance. In disease, it's about how easy it is to control the disease. So septoria triticide is of very high importance when considering a variety, because even with fungicides, if the weather is wet, it's not very easy to control. You can't always get control of it. Yellow rust is of high importance. Yes, it's a destructive disease, but with fungicides, at least at the moment, you can control it. Brown rust is a less important disease. And not only do the importance change between different groups, but actually in different regions it will change. So for the instance of wheat, distilling quality is of very high importance when you're judging a variety in the northern region. So we judge varieties on lots of different characteristics. And obviously with different crops, we have different characteristics to judge them on. So is yield everything? Well, no, it isn't. And even varieties that yield well below our yield target can get recommended if they offer something special. So this year, we recommended a variety based on its quality. That was swallow winter wheat. It's 4.1% below our yield target, so well down into this area of unlikely to recommend. And the reason we recommended it was because it has excellent distilling quality. So we only recommended it in the north, where distilling quality is important, but it did have excellent distilling quality and some other features which benefit the north. Last year, we had a variety of exceptional disease resistance. That was Theodore winter wheat. Again, 4.1% below the yield target. It was recommended for the west due to its exceptional disease resistance. Now, these aren't the sort of varieties that are going to take 10 or 15% of the UK wheat area, but they have important characteristics which can be of use to levy payers in some areas for some reasons. And so varieties can get recommended even if they're well below the yield target if they have these other benefits. So yield isn't everything. Yes, it's important, but it certainly isn't everything. The other way varieties can get recommended if their yields are lower is if they're specialist varieties. We have these specialist categories which provide specialist traits which can be attractive to farmers for certain reasons. Specialist varieties have different yield targets and they're always lower than the main yield target. Why do we have specialist categories? Well, two main reasons. One is to introduce innovation into the list. And a good example of that is turnip yellow's virus resistance in oilseed rape. The first varieties to have that trait were lower yielding than the elite varieties, but we wanted to have it on the list. And so we produced a specialist category for turnip yellow's virus resistance. After a few years on the list, the breeders managed to get that resistance into most elite varieties, and indeed all the highest yielding varieties on the list currently have turnip yellow's virus, and so that is no longer a specialist category. That it served its purpose and it has been removed. The other reason we have specialist categories is to cater for small markets. I've got examples on the table below of grain distilling. It's a small market in Scotland, but it's an important market. And club root resistance in oilseed rape, Hull in oilseed rape are good examples. They're never going to be the majority of the varieties, but they're important traits that we want to have on the list, and so we allow them to be there with lower target yields than they would otherwise need to get onto the list. Just a brief word about our described lists. When you go through the recommended lists, you'll find that some lists are recommended and some are what were described as described. And these are for the minor crops, linseed, or spring oilseed rape, winter rye, and winter triticale. The trials that sit behind these described lists are small in number compared to the recommended lists. So, for instance, on the wheat recommended list and the yields, some of those varieties will have over 200 trials behind those yield numbers. On the described list, we have a much smaller number of trials. And they're just there to provide information on varieties that are likely to be commercially available. Because the number of trials is small, differences between varieties are often not statistically significant. So you need to have some caution when interpreting the described list. Varieties are added to the described list if they're national listed and if seed is likely to be available. But the presence on a DL is not a recommendation. It's simply to provide information on varieties that you're likely to be able to find seed for. Some people say the varieties hang around on the list too long when they're past their sell-by date, but we do have a specific mechanism for removing varieties from the list. If we have a major breakdown occurs in a variety, we'll remove it immediately. So back a few years ago, there was a variety of winter wheat called Torch. It came onto the list one year, and then the following season, it immediately broke down very badly to yellow rust. And so that was immediately removed from the recommended list the following year. Oilseed rape varieties are removed from the list after 2 years, unless there's strong commercial interest in them going forwards. That's because recommended list varieties oilseed rape varieties turn over very quickly in the market. There are some that hang around for longer, varieties like Campus, but most turn over very quickly. Cereal varieties are reviewed if their certified seed area falls below a certain threshold. That threshold varies depending on what sort of wheat it is. And varieties generally come off the list once they're no longer widely grown. Varieties are removed from descriptive lists if seed is no longer available, if their yield falls a long way behind the highest yielding varieties, or if the breeder says they don't want them to appear on the list anymore, and that does sometimes happen. So that's the how the recommended list system works. I just got a few slides to give you some information on how to use the recommended list. So you probably won't be able to read much of that. This comes from the start of the recommended list booklet. This is also available on the website. There's some really useful information at the start of how to use the recommended list, what the different parts of the tables actually mean, and things like maps show you where the different regions lie on the recommended list. On the tables themselves, big tables, lots of data, takes a bit of interpreting, but then that's what you're going to be doing as agronomists. You'll be interpreting this data for your clients. I just wanted to pick out a couple of points on these. First of all, the control varieties. They are not the highest yielding varieties, as you'll see. They are varieties which are established in the market and have been stable for some time. And then our control varieties are used to establish our percentage of yields. So the yields are presented as a percentage of the controls, and the yields are always higher than you'll expect in a commercial situation. That is because just the nature of trials. There are a number of reasons. They all receive very high levels of fungicide inputs, but also just the specific nature of trials means that they always yield higher than commercial crops. Another important area to look at is on the right-hand side of the tables. We have LSDs, least significant differences, and this is a statistical measure. You may not like statistics, but this is quite important. So what this shows is the minimum difference between two varieties for it to be statistically significant at the 95% level. Now, you might say that in order to choose a new variety, you don't necessarily need to be 95% sure it's better than the one that you're growing at the moment, but that's a discussion for another point, another time, and that's how the recommended list works at the moment. And what you'll find in some cases is that there is information on the table which is bracketed. What that means is there is less information available, or a small amount of information available for that figure. So when you're comparing two varieties, two numbers on the recommended list, if one of them is bracketed, then this LSD will actually be bigger. This is an average LSD. The LSD will be bigger when the variety is one of the varieties bracketed, so that difference needs to be even bigger to be significant. And if you're comparing two bracketed figures, that LSD is bigger again. So just be careful and be a little bit more cautious when you're comparing two bracketed figures. As well as the page at the start, there's also useful information at the bottom and the footnotes. So just be aware of that when you're looking through the recommended list. Particularly if you're viewing the tables online, there is other information elsewhere. Of course, we've already talked about the website. The new recommended list was released yesterday, so all the tables are already available there to view. Also, we have the recommended list booklet. It's a solid publication. It's been around for a long time, and it will be around for a long time in the future. We did do a review of the recommended list program a couple of years ago, and both growers and agronomists were very keen we kept the physical RL publication. As I said at the start, if you're really into your varieties, you can go and look at the protocols online. You can look at our crop committee handbook, which guides the way our committees select varieties. You can see archive recommended lists there as well. And there's plenty of information on the recommended list on our website, so I'll encourage you to go and look at that to get a full understanding of how the recommended list program works. Another service we provide is our harvest results. So during harvest in July and August, results are coming in all the time, and people are often very keen to know those results as soon as possible, particularly for the candidate varieties, to get a clue of which ones are likely to be recommended. We publish those results, as they come in the form of Excel spreadsheets, so you can see all the data for individual trials. As it's Excel, you can download it and tinker around with it and play with it to your heart's content. We do produce some commentary with those, but that's really for the press and perhaps for the farmer more than for the agronomist who can interpret these figures themselves. Now, no doubt you'll have been asked to sign up for lots of things already, but if you want to sign up for harvest results and haven't, at the bottom of the RL page, there's a sign up place. You can go in there, and there's a box to tick to receive harvest results, and then you'll receive them as emails as we release them in the summer. We've already talked about the app, or Fiona has already talked about the app. The app replaces a physical publication, our pocket books, which were designed to be used in the field, put in your pocket, as the name would suggest, and of course you can do that with the app. The app's got a number of useful features. It contains both recommended and described varieties, and it also contains the candidate varieties. Those are varieties that are in their first year of recommended list trials, which may be recommended in the future. It's free to download on Apple and Android. Fortunately, it works offline, so if you're in the middle of a field, in the middle of Norfolk, with your client, it will still be able to work even if you can't get a phone signal. As Fiona said, it has search and favourites functions and notes functions. It does the things that we wanted the pocket books to do. And importantly, it has in-season updates with the latest information. So the candidate varieties, if they're not national listed, when we do our publications, we can't show the data on those varieties. We're legally not allowed to. But as soon as those candidates get their national listing status, we update the website, and we also update the app. So the app is a really good, useful way of keeping up with the candidate varieties, and I certainly use it for that. Another thing we have, this is on our website, are our variety selection tools. One thing the recommended list does get criticised for, particularly the wheat list, is there's an enormous amount of data, lots of tables showing different information, and quite a lot of varieties. And farmers in particular sometimes struggle to process all that information and see through to the varieties they want. So we developed this tool last year. We've got them for all the major crops. And the purpose of them is to allow you to filter and sort varieties. So there's lots of different categories you can sort on, everything from disease ratings through yields, quality, specific weight and Hagberg, and end markets. And the different crops have their different filters. So you can select data from different regions, and you can look at treated and untreated yields. You change the importance of these different characteristics. So there's the graph of yield against something we call agronomic merit. And agronomic merit is a combination of disease ratings and agronomic features such as lodging. And we use a calculation to work out their agronomic merit. You can change the weighting of those. So, for instance, if you're in an area where yellow rust isn't important, not quite sure where that is anymore, but if you didn't think yellow rust was important, you could downgrade it from high importance to low importance. And that would change the calculation of this agronomic merit, would change the graph slightly. So the variety tools are available on our website, and I encourage you to go there and tinker around with them. I've just done a quick example of how they work. So in this example, it's winter wheat. I've selected group 4 varieties. I've decided I don't want to spend a fortune on fungicides, so I've selected varieties that are above 6 on their septoria rating. And I've had a problem with yellow rust over the last couple of years, so I'm only selecting varieties with a yellow rust rating of above 7. But what that has done is that's cut me down. Just those 3 simple filters have reduced the number of varieties to quite a small number. Saki looks like a good one on this. It's got the highest yield. But then I think maybe Theodore looks really good. It's got a very high agronomic merit. I'm a bit risk averse. Perhaps Theodore is the variety for me. But then I realised, well, actually, I'm looking at UK data here, but actually, I'm growing in the north. I'm in the south of Scotland, so perhaps I should select north data only. So if I select north data only, keeping other filters the same, all of a sudden Theodore drops right off on the yield. Theodore doesn't yield very well in the north. So it brings me back to Saki. I might want to look at some of these other varieties. Revelation looks like it's a bit too low yielding for me. But then you've filtered yourself down to a small number of varieties, and you can then go look at the recommended list and perhaps look at some local trials, speak to your agronomist, or discuss with a colleague which of these varieties would be most suitable. And of course, you could pick others, put other filters on, and eventually get yourself down to one variety if that's the way you wanted to do it. So again, there are different things on different crop variety selection tools, and there are different aspects to each of the tools. So I encourage you to go and use these. There might be an interesting way to discuss variety selection with your clients. Updates on these. Things are updated at different times. The new RL tables are published on the website at the beginning of every December. Actually, they were 30th of November this year, but generally at the beginning of December. The variety selection tools get updated through December and January. It takes a little bit of time to get all the information into those tools. We make the final selections on varieties only the week before we release the data. So it's all very much rushed at the end. So the variety selection tools are updated going forward, starting with wheat and spring barley, which are the most frequently used. The RL app gets updated in January. Again, it takes a little bit of time to get the data into the app and to be proofread to make sure we're sending out completely accurate data. And then the first edition of the physical publication arrives usually sometime in February. I've said end of February because there can be delays in the system. We aim to get it out at the beginning of February onto your doormats. Then there's a second edition produced in the summer for summer events, and that's all available to order as well. Finally, if we do have any events next summer, hopefully you'll be able to come and meet some of the team, our variety experts, our field team, and Catherine, who will be talking to you in a moment, our disease expert. And also, we don't normally let the data team out of the office, but occasionally you do get to see them at events as well. But if we are about next summer, please do come and talk to us about the recommended list and how to get the best out of it. Thank you very much. That's all from me. Thank you, Fiona.
Thank you very much, Paul. That was a very comprehensive introduction to the recommended list. And we have had some questions coming in. Before I start on the question, just a reminder that all of the information can be found at ahdb.org.uk/RL. There you will find links to the variety selection tool. There'll be a link to be able to order a hard copy of the publication when it's available in February. You can email now and they'll put you on the waiting list and send it out as soon as that is ready. And there's also the link to the app on there. So that is your go-to for anything variety, is ahdb.org.uk/RL. So Paul, you mentioned the recommended list was recently reviewed. It went through the process. So what came out of that review? Will there be any changes to future-proof the recommended list to make sure that the information is still as useful going forward?
Yes, so there are some areas that were identified where growers felt they needed more information. So an example is vigour of oilseed rape. Obviously, people are really struggling to grow oilseed rape with flea beetle issues, and vigorous varieties seem to be the ones which do best. So we've currently got trials in the ground this autumn and then next spring, looking at how we can measure vigour. We did a survey a couple of years ago at cereals to ask people what they thought vigour meant, and we also asked the breeders, and unfortunately everyone came up with a different answer. People have different ideas of what vigour means, but we think we've got a definition which we can measure that everyone is more or less agreed on. So if we can get that to work and we can find clear differences between varieties, we will put that on the recommended list, probably not next year, maybe the year after. And there are lots of other areas people are asking, but we are limited by resources, so we have to pick and choose which things we can do. But we do review it all the time just to make sure it is still relevant to what farmers are looking for.
Great, thank you. So is there going to be room on the recommended list for varieties that are diverse or approved species blends?
That's a difficult one. I think it's a direction which people are moving towards in certain areas. I mean, organic growers have been doing that for a while now. I think it's very attractive. I'm not sure about the rules about selling blends, because there are specific rules about variety purity. But I think it's possibly something that might come into the recommended list in the future. We've got no immediate plans to do it. I think the Danes have a small number of variety blends that they use in their variety trials, but it's not something we're intending to introduce in the future. But we are aware it's out there, and we do sort of keep it in the back of our minds.
Great. And you mentioned then organic growers will often use blends. Can the recommended list be used in organic situations as well as conventional? Yes,
I mean, it can be used in any situation, whether you're organic or you're a really high input, high output, or whether you're a conventional sort of lower input system. There's lots of information in there for organic growers, and things like disease resistance is obviously important for them, quality characteristics, things like height, lodging without PGO. There are things in there. Obviously, they're not going to get the yields in an organic system which conventional growers will get, but actually many varieties that yield well in conventional systems also yield well in organic systems. There are exceptions, and there are areas where organic farmers are really interested, such as competitiveness with weeds, which the RL doesn't look at. But again, we are limited by resources. So there are really so many things we can look at.
And one final quick question. It may not be quick. So you mentioned that the RL has weightings for different qualities.
Yeah.
Are you noticing any disease pressure changes with all of the extreme weather conditions that we've had? And if you have noticed any changes, will that affect the weighting for the RL tables?
So it's a bit of a moving feast. So if we go back a few years, 2012, and then again 2014, we had record levels of Septoria tritici in crops. We had 2 wet summers, and Septoria kind of shot up everyone's importance level, and we did focus quite heavily on Septoria. Growers were looking for varieties which had better Septoria resistance. Then we've had a couple of dry springs where septoria hasn't really been a problem, but yellow rust has become much more of an issue, particularly with the shifting patterns of rust population, which Catherine will talk about in a minute. So we do keep things under review. Septoria did go up from high importance to very high importance in wheat a few years ago. So we do, as I said, keep things under review, and not only just how important is the disease in terms of its frequency, but actually do we have the chemistry to control it? And I think with us losing epoxiconazole, perhaps yellow rust will become more difficult to control. We might want to move yellow rust up to very important. We'll have to see how things develop commercially.
Great, thank you very much. We will bring you back for some more questions later on, Paul. So if anyone has any further questions they would like to ask Paul, please do keep them coming in the chat box, and we'll review those later on. Next session is with Catherine Harries, who is the crop health and protection scientist, and she will be going through the disease aspect of the recommended list. This will be a more interactive session, so we will be using the polls. Just to note that for the best viewing experience, it's best on a desktop, because when you open the polls tab, the stream will carry on running. If you are using a mobile device or a tablet this morning, the video may pause as you go onto the polls. You can overcome this by switching to two devices. You can have the polls on one and the live stream on another. If not, just come back into the stream afterwards and just move the progress bar to the right stage so that you are still live with us. So if you do have any questions, I'll direct you to the help button on the left hand side of your screen, and our team will be able to assist you there. So please do let us know if you're having any issues. So over to you, Catherine. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Hope you're well. So my name is Catherine Harries, and I manage cereals and oilseeds disease research at AHDB, and that includes being responsible for the recommended list disease ratings. Before I worked at AHDB, I worked in trials, but I've been at AHDB for about 3 years now. So today we're going to talk about, next slide please, Heather. Today we're going to talk about how we produce the recommended list disease ratings, how you as agronomists can use these ratings, and then we're going to have a go at seeing what data go into the ratings by having a go at some disease ID and assessing. Next slide, please. So this is where you can find the disease ratings, in this case for winter wheat. And if you've got an RL booklet with you now, turn to this page so you can see it in the booklet. And these are all the diseases we do ratings for. Last year was actually the last year we did ratings for Septoria nodorum, and this disease used to be an important disease of wheat in the UK, but it's now so minor that it's not worth doing a rating for. But if it was to increase in importance again, we would consider reintroducing ratings. And as Paul's been through, you can see there's some ratings that are bracketed, which means they're based on limited data. And then we, as Paul said, we should always look at the LSD when looking at disease ratings. So if the difference between two ratings for different varieties for the same disease is smaller than the LSD, then that means the varieties are not statistically significantly different from each other. And you can see here that only Septoria triticale is shown to 1 decimal place. But if you look at the Excel tables online, you can see all the ratings to 1 decimal place. It would just get a bit cluttered if we showed all of them in the booklet, which is why only Septoria is. Next slide, please. So how do we get to these ratings? As Paul said, we have trials all over the UK. These are all in different soil types with different disease pressures, different drilling dates. And the trial operators collect disease data from the plots that are untreated with fungicides. Most of the trials are in farm crops, so are naturally infected by disease, but we do have a few trials that we purposefully inoculate with the disease we're interested in to make sure we definitely get the disease. So we gather all the data together, and scrutinise each assessment, deciding which assessments to use, which not to, and our consultant pathologists at NIAB help us with selecting the data. We try to only use what we call good assessments, and by this we mean that disease levels are high enough to give good discrimination between varieties. Once we've been through all the data, we do some statistical analyses to standardise it and make it all comparable. One of these analyses is to log transform the data. So that might sound complicated, but I'll explain later on why it's important for you to know. We then take the data from around the last 3 years and calculate an average level of disease for each variety, for each disease. And then it comes on to working out a rating for each variety using this average level of disease. And we'll see how this is done in a minute. Next slide, please. So this is where we need to understand the log transformation of the data. What log transformation does is makes outliers to a data set less of a problem. So, for example, with disease data, many varieties get between 0 and 10% of a particular disease, but not many varieties would get 40 to 50% disease. And the log transformation means that the differences in disease levels is more at the lower disease levels than at the higher disease levels. So the difference between a 0 and a 10 is greater than the difference between a 40 and 50% once the data are log transformed. And what this means for the ratings is that the difference in levels of disease you'll see between varieties at the lower end of the rating scale is bigger than the difference in levels of disease you'll see between varieties at the top end of the rating scale. So, for example, this picture shows some varieties with different septoria ratings. And if you just look at how much green leaf area there is, the difference between a 4 and a 5 is bigger than the difference between a 6 and a 7. And that's because we log transform the data. Next slide, please. So now we understand that, let's have a look at what to do with that 3-year average level of disease we worked out before. So we use this average to calculate a rating, and this is worked out using a slope on a graph. And the top and bottom of this slope is set using known susceptible and resistant varieties. And normally we also set a 9 equals 0. So if a variety gets a rating of 9, that theoretically means it gets 0% disease. We then set the rating by reading what rating a certain amount of disease gives. And you can see along this line are all the different levels of disease for each variety, and they've all been assigned a rating based on their level of disease. And that's how the ratings are worked out. Next slide, please. So how can you, as an agronomist, use the ratings to your advantage? They can be used for IPM, to improve your client's margins and to reduce the risk from disease. For example, where fungicide sprays are delayed by the weather. And careful varietal selection is an important tool for targeting, prioritising and reducing fungicide use. You need to make sure you consider local and regional disease risks when deciding what disease resistance is the most important for your region. And these maps give an indication of UK risk for a range of diseases. So we've got wheat, barley and oilseed rape diseases here. So for example, both brown rust in wheat and barley, the risk is much greater in the south than in the north. So you might be comfortable growing a relatively brown rust susceptible variety in Scotland, whereas in the south this would be much more risky and you'd probably want to look for a variety with at least medium resistance. But you should also keep your ear to the ground for local reports of disease and consider these risks. For example, this map shows that the west of the UK is only medium risk for yellow rust in wheat. And that used to be the case, but we're now getting more and more reports of this disease in the west and even in Northern Ireland. Next slide, please. So when we're growing a more resistant variety, how can we give growers the confidence to cut back on fungicides and have the chance at increasing their margins? AHDB have a project running at the moment, which is run jointly by ADAS, NIAB and SIUC. And this looks at the effect that different control measures have on septoria levels and their ultimate yield. They've been looking at the effect of variety, fungicide and drill date, and this chart shows some of the results from the 2020 trial. 2020 trials, there are a few trials in 2020. So 3 different varieties with different septoria resistance ratings were grown. We've got Elation with a rating of 4.3, Illicit with a rating of 5.5, and KWS Firefly with a rating of 7. And the trials were run both as early drilled, so in September, and we can see these data on the left, and late drilled, so in October and November time, these data are shown on the right. And both untreated low, medium and high intensity fungicide regimes were used, as shown by the different colour bars. We can see that the untreated septoria levels decreased as the variety's resistance increased, and later sowing also had a big impact on reducing septoria levels in all varieties and all treatments. And here, from the 2020 trials, it looks like all the varieties reacted similarly to the different low, medium and high fungicide regimes. But when we've looked at this in higher disease years and looked at it across years and looked at the margin achieved from each combination of variety and fungicide regime, we've seen that growing a more resistant variety and using a lower intensity fungicide program can often drastically increase margin compared to using more susceptible varieties with higher intensity fungicide programs. So this strategy can be risky if you're in a high disease pressure area, but the risk is drastically reduced compared to normal when more disease resistant varieties are grown compared to when they're not. And as an aside, this chart also shows a compelling case for later drilling to reduce disease, as well as the benefits it has for blackgrass. And until recently, more disease-resistant varieties tended to yield lower, whilst higher yielding ones needed a belt and braces fungicide regime. But now we're seeing more and more varieties that have high disease resistance that yield the same or as good as varieties with lower disease resistance. So there's no reason not to grow more resistant varieties. Next slide, please. Something else to bear in mind when thinking about disease resistance and resistance ratings is how the resistance operates for different diseases. So it's not always possible to know this because we don't know what resistance genes breeders use, but we can split the mechanisms into multi or minor gene resistance and single or major gene resistance. So single or major gene resistance is when the resistance in a variety is based on one major gene. And this gives very effective resistance, sometimes can give absolutely complete resistance, but it means that if the pathogen population, this resistance can very quickly and completely be overcome. And this is otherwise known as a variety breaking down to a disease. And it's the sort of resistance we mainly have for yellow rust. And at the moment, we're seeing the yellow rust pathogen population becoming more and more diverse, and pressure is getting higher, and we're seeing variety breakdowns quite frequently at the moment. So on the other hand, multi or minor gene resistance is when there are many genes that all give a small contribution to the resistance in a variety. And this means that if the pathogen population changes, the resistance is unlikely to be affected much, and the variety's resistance will be largely the same as before. And this is the sort of resistance we mainly have for septoria. And although it doesn't tend to give such a high level of resistance overall, it's what we call durable, and it can usually be relied upon. So that's why septoria ratings tend to be stable, whereas yellow rust ratings can see big changes from year to year. Next slide, please. So these resistance genes that can also operate at different times in the plant's life cycle. So, for example, many varieties have different resistance to yellow rust at the young plant stage, so that's before around growth stage 55, and at the adult plant stage. And this means that varieties with a high recommended list yellow rust rating, so of 7, 8 or 9, might still get quite high levels of disease at the T0 and T1 timings before their resistance kicks in by around the T2 timing, possibly just after. And most varieties on the recommended list at the moment that are resistant at the adult stage are actually susceptible at the seedling stage. So you would expect to see disease on these resistant varieties before T2. And in this case, you'd need probably a fungicide spray to keep a lid on it to stop it getting out of control. And information on young plant resistance and susceptibility is produced by the United Kingdom Cereal Pathogen Virulence Survey, or the UK CPVS, which monitors the changes in the UK's pathogen population, and it can be found at this link here. And the UK CPVS are always looking for samples of wheat, yellow and brown rust, especially from varieties that we wouldn't normally expect to get yellow or brown rust. Next slide, please. So that's how the disease ratings are calculated, and if you want to know more, you can visit ahdb.org.uk/RL disease ratings. Next slide, please. So now we're going to have a go at some virtual disease assessing in the same way that's done to generate the recommended list disease ratings, to give you an idea of the data that go into the ratings. And this should also be useful for your role as agronomists for monitoring disease levels in crops. So first, let's get some disease diagnosis problems out the way. So it can be very difficult to distinguish between septoria and old yellow rust symptoms, and often you need to visit the trial or crop regularly throughout the season to be sure what the disease is. And that's because old yellow rust tends to produce a necrotic dead and brown area of the leaf, just like septoria does. But there are some characteristic features of these two diseases that enables us to distinguish them. So you can see in this picture that septoria has these small black pycnidia on the left. And if the lesion was old yellow rust, the area would be brown and dead like this, but it wouldn't have the pycnidia, unless, of course, septoria had come in on the back of old yellow rust, which can complicate things. Whereas active yellow rust always has these distinctive yellow pustules like on the right, and usually in stripes, except early on in the season, sometimes it's not in stripes. So as a general rule of thumb, you should only score the disease as yellow rust if you can see the characteristic yellow pustules of yellow rust, and only score the disease as septoria if you can see the pycnidia. If you can just see necrotic tissues with no pustules or pycnidia, then we can't possibly say what it was or what it is due to. So you should do a Greenleaf area score where you just estimate the percent of leaf that is green. Next slide, please. Now there's also a complication with yellow rust in that it can develop these teleospores later on in the season. And these can be confused with septoria pycnidia, but they're much bigger and often in stripes like the original yellow rust pustules. So they should be quite easy to distinguish. And we didn't used to see these teleospores much in this country, but in recent years they've been becoming more and more prevalent, so you're probably likely to see them in the coming years. Next slide, please. And these pictures give a good example of where the confusion can arise. Here we can just see large areas of dead tissue, and if we come to this without seeing this crop for weeks, we could easily assume it was septoria. But if you look closer, there aren't actually any pycnidia, and this crop actually had old yellow rust where the pustules have died off, and it's just leaving dead areas of the leaf. Next slide, please. And these just show some other examples of how it can get confusing. So the left-hand picture shows a mix of diseases. We've got septoria, yellow rust, brown rust. I don't know if you can pick them out with such a small slide. And the right-hand picture shows the contrast between septoria pycnidia and yellow rust telea. So the yellow rust telea are much larger than the pycnidia. Next slide, please. And then this is just a picture of something that we never knew for sure what it was. There was never any pycnidia or pustules. There was just chlorotic tissue and stripes. So it could be stress or another environmental factor, or it could be yellow rust that is not completing its life cycle or sporulating. And in this case, we wouldn't score it as anything, we just score the green leaf area. Next slide, please. So to recap, only score it as yellow rust if you see the pustules, only score it as septoria if you see the pycnidia, and if you just see dead leaf, then this could be anything, so score the green leaf area. And we do have a YouTube video made in collaboration with NIAB with some more information on disease assessing. Next slide, please. So now we'll get onto some disease assessing. You should be able to find a link to the handout on the page where you've accessed this webinar. If you open that now, but we'll run through what's in the handout anyway. So this is the assessment key we use in the RL trials. We look at the top 4 leaves in a crop and score all the necrotic, so that means dead, and chlorotic, so that means yellowing, tissue that we know is due to disease, and record this as % infection. And today we'll be scoring a recommended list trial in Herefordshire on the 18th of June 2019. So think back to that sunny time when we could all meet in fields. And today we'll be assessing all the dead tissue as septoria, because we know that's what it was, and you wouldn't be able to tell from the photos what it was, so I'm telling you it's septoria. Normally we'd look at 4 different places in the plot and take an average for recommended list disease assessing, but today we're just going to do it on 1 photo. Next slide, please. So this slide shows the assessment keys for the different diseases for information, but we're focusing on septoria today, so I'll skip onto that. Next slide, please. So this shows what each level of % infection looks like. So we have 0% infection, no septoria. 0.1% infection would be 1 lesion per 10 tillers. 1% infection would be 2 small lesions per tiller. 5% infection, small lesions are beginning to form dead areas of tissue across the width of the leaf. 10% infection, 2 lower leaves, large areas of diseased tissue with some covering 1/3 of the leaf. 25% leaves appear half infected, half green, which can seem counterintuitive that half infected is 25%, but it's very easy to overestimate disease, which is why it's like that. 50% leaves appear more infected than green, 75% very little green leaf tissue left, and 100% leaves dead with no green tissue left. And if any of you have worked in trials and maybe done fungicide trial assessing, where you assess each leaf layer individually, this is different from that. We bulk together the top 4 leaves and take an average. So it might be a bit difficult to switch, but have a go. So next slide, please. So if we start off with a few examples, here's a crop of wheat infected with septoria. If we take this leaf, so click on please, there's no disease on it, so that's 0% infection. But if we look at this leaf, click on, yes, it's got small lesions beginning to form areas of dead tissue across the width of the leaf, so that's the description for 5% disease. So let's look at 10%, 2 lower leaves, large area of diseased tissue, some covering 1/3 of the leaf. It's probably not that severe, so we're going to give it a 7%. Although if I were to look at the crop overall and take into account all the top 4 leaf layers, I'd probably give it more like a 10% overall, as there are a large area of diseased tissues on the 2 lower leaves, some covering 1/3 of the leaf. So next example, please, Heather. So then here's another crop. If I look at it overall, there's quite a bit more disease. So I'll start at 25%. Leaves appear half infected, half green, and having 25% is looking, as I said, it might not be, even though it's 25%, it might still have half the leaf infected. Sorry, can you click back, please, Heather? Thank you. So I'm going to go for more like 17 to 20% overall for this crop. But if we pick out this leaf and the next leaf, thank you, these individual leaves have a lot more disease. So we'll zoom in on the first one to start with. Next slide, please. So if we look at the key, the leaf seems like it is half infected and half green, but only just, so we'll give it a 30% disease. Whereas if we zoom in on the next leaf, next slide, please, it's definitely more infected than green and is close to having very little green leaf tissue left, so I'll give it a 60% here. Great, so now we're going to do one more practice. Next slide, please, before you have a go yourself. So have a think what % disease you think this crop is. There's a key down the side for septoria, so have a look down and see what it might be. Maybe 1%, 2 small lesions per tiller. Maybe it's a bit more than that, so move up to 5%. Small lesion beginning to form dead areas of tissue across the width of the leaf. Yep, I can see that's happening on a few of the leaves. So we go up to 10% and look at the 2 lower leaves. A large area of diseased tissue, some covering a third of the leaf. So, okay, it's probably not that bad. So let's go for 7% for that crop. Okay, now you're going to have a go yourself. If you click onto the next slide and open the poll, there's the link at the bottom for where you can find the poll. So hopefully you've all managed to get onto that, and you've got some options for how much disease this crop has. Look down the side, go through each of the amounts and see what you think it is. If you're not sure where to start, have a look at what the green leaf area is, as well as the diseased area, to get an idea. Okay, are we ready to move on to the second one? I'll let Heather decide how long to give you because she'll see. Okay, so this is the second poll. So see what you think about this. If you're not sure where to start, have a look at what you scored in the last picture and think about if this crop has more or less disease than the last one, and take it from there. Work through the percents. Okay, we're ready to go on to the third poll, third and final one. So this is the last poll. And again, a good starting point is to think about what you scored for the last crop and if this has more or less. And look at the green leaf area. Remember to take an average of the top 4 leaves. It's a bit difficult to see the leaf layers here, I know, but we can do our best. Okay, if you've had enough time to do that, we can have a look at the results. So for the first picture, we have everybody gave it either 10 to 20% or 20 to 30% disease. Oh, it's moving. 10 to 20, looks like it's winning at the moment. So that would be around 2 lower leaves, large areas of diseased tissue, some covering a third of the leaf. And between that and 25%, leaves appear half infected, half green. So yeah, I scored it 25, but I think that's a good go. Lots of people have scored between 10 and 30, so that's perfect. Well done. Okay, next poll. Okay, so here we have a bit more of a range, although the ranges I gave you were smaller, so it's a bit more difficult. 57% said it was 0 to 2, 14% said it was 3 to 5, and 29% said it was 6 to 7. So if we look at what 6 to 7 would be, that would be more than small lesions beginning to form areas of dead tissue across the width of the leaf. I'm just getting the picture up myself because I can't see it on that screen. Yeah, okay, so I'm not sure I can quite see that. If you look at just the top 4 leaves, I can't see that many that have such large areas of diseased tissue, and I actually gave it a 1%, but this is where it gets difficult. You can see some tipping on the leaves, and that won't be septoria, that will be just tipping. So that wouldn't be scored as disease, but you can't see that in this picture. And there are some lower leaves that are all senesced. So yeah, it's difficult online, but most people got 1%, so that's good. And it doesn't really matter what you get, as long as you're consistent within yourself. So if you scored this more than the last picture, then perhaps you're doing something wrong, but well, you wouldn't be able to because it's not the options. But yeah, well done. So on the last poll, please. Unanimous. Everyone chose 5 to 10%, and that's exactly what I chose, about 8 to 10%. I've said it is. So everyone's perfect at it now. You can all go out and do your own disease assessing. So what is 5 to 10%? 5% small lesions beginning to form areas of dead tissue across the width of the leaf. Yep, there's definitely that happening. And then 10%, the 2 lower leaves, large areas of diseased tissue, some covering a third of the leaf. Yeah, so it's around about between 5 to 10%. So perfect. I hope you all enjoyed that. That's the end of my section. So we've been through how to calculate disease ratings, how you can use them, and then some disease assessing. And yeah, I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Catherine. That was a really enjoyable session. I didn't vote, but I probably did. One question we have here is, are there any supporting resources to help with the disease assessments when people are out doing assessments, during the season? Is there anything that can help them while they're out?
Yeah, so we do have a video on how to score wheat diseases. So that's similar to what I've been through today. We have a YouTube video, as I mentioned. We've also got one on ramularia, because that can be a very difficult disease to identify and assess. We've got some information on the AHDB website, I think, to do with the recommended list and how diseases are assessed. But yeah, the videos are really the best place to go and look at the keys there. And yeah, I'd encourage you to watch the ramularia one as well, because that's possibly going to be a disease increasing in importance in the next few years.
Great. And in your experience, do many growers do their own disease assessments, or do they rely entirely on their agronomist? And do they use these assessments to decide whether to apply the fungicides, or do they just generally go with a pre-decided T1, T2?
So I wish more farmers did their own disease assessing rather than relying on their agronomists, because it's good to get two opinions and, you know, for farmers to be making their own decisions, and because they know their crops and their land better than anyone else. I do know some farmers who do their own disease assessing. Our very own strategic farmer, Brian Barker, does, and he monitors disease levels in his different crops and correlates that to the variety and what applications it's had. It's difficult to predict the level of disease at spray application. It's difficult to predict the level of disease at the end of the season when you're looking at the level of disease at spray application. So that's not always a good way to decide whether or not to do a spray, but you can include other things in that decision, as well as the disease levels, such as the weather forecast, what variety you're growing, and the history of the farm. And it's important to note that you don't necessarily need a clean crop to get a good margin. You might accept a certain level of disease in your crop to, you know, get a better margin depending on what fungicide regime you use.
That brings us nicely onto the strategic farms. So both the strategic cereal farm east and the strategic cereal farm west are doing managed low input trials. So they are looking at different varieties and with different ratings and how they perform under different fungicide regimes, as well as yield and disease data. There'll also be the gross margin will be calculated. So that just adds another element to the research that AHDB is already doing. You can find out more information about those trials on the website under the Farm Excellence tab. So we've got a question here, Catherine. Is there any data published about plant disease resistance, young plant disease resistance?
Yes, so the UK CPVS that I mentioned before produced these data, and we publish each year just before the recommended list is published which varieties have seedling resistance and seedling susceptibility. And I did put the link in one of the slides. I think it's young AHDB young plant resistance. And although we only have resistant or susceptible, but it is a sliding scale, it's not that binary. We just don't have enough data at the moment to produce ratings like we do for the adult plant stage in the RL. Yeah.
We'll bring Paul in, and I'll just ask you one final question while he is coming on. So someone said that they have seen adult plant resistance to yellow rust clicks in around flag leaf emergence. You said that it was at growth stage 55. So can you clarify when it does kick in?
Yeah, so we don't really know when it kicks in. It's different when using different resistance genes, and so in different varieties. So in some varieties it could kick in much earlier, but then we know that the latest in any variety it's kicked in is 55, which is why we say 55 as, you know, to catch all of the varieties. But hopefully in most varieties it does come in earlier, because that's obviously when it's more useful for being able to cut back on fungicides. So yeah, we don't know, but by 55 it should have operated by then.
We've got Paul back with us now, so I'll hand over to Paul for Paul, we've got a question here. Is there a big difference to how varieties respond to different establishment methods?
So that is something that seems to be the case, and it's an area where the RL has a bit of a blind spot. Most of our trials are established by fairly intensive cultivations, not necessarily ploughing, but fairly intensive cultivations, and there is some information now suggesting some varieties do better in a zero or no-till situation than others, and we know a lot of farmers are moving either to very reduced or zero till. Unfortunately, it's a case of resources. Obviously, we can't run two parallel systems with different cultivation systems. I think the breeders even themselves don't fully understand why some varieties do better than others in a no or very low till situation. When we have a better understanding of why that happens, it may be possible to do some work in the RL if there are some traits that varieties have which will indicate why they do better in certain cultivation systems than others. We might be able to measure that. But I think running different cultivation systems for the different trials for the trials would be out of the question. We just don't have the resources to do something like that.
Okay. So Paul, you have got a lot of background in fungicide performance that AHDB run. So in your opinion, what's the difference in the timeline between the breakdown of resistance that's in a variety and the efficacy of fungicides? Is one particularly more prevalent and quicker than the other, or are they kind of on par?
No, I mean it's very difficult to predict the durability of resistance in variety. I'm sure Catherine would perhaps want to comment on this as well. Some genes will be overcome very quickly. Some remain durable for a long time. I mean, the MLO resistance gene in spring barley is a single major gene, which in theory are very vulnerable to being overcome by resistance, and yet it's remained durable for years and years, whereas other genes are overcome very quickly. It's similar with fungicides. So obviously multisites, which we only have one left now, they've been around for many decades without being overcome by resistance. The strobilurium fungicides were overcome by septoria very quickly, whereas other things like azoles have seen their effectiveness decline somewhat, but are still useful in fungicide programs. So it's not very predictable. I don't know if Catherine wants to comment on that at all.
Well, the only thing I would say is that I know there's a rumour going around that in order to protect variety resistance, you need to keep, if a variety's got good resistance, in order to protect it, you need to keep your fungicide rates robust, so that the variety protects the fungicide and the fungicide protects the variety. But this isn't strictly true. If you're growing a resistant variety, you need to protect fungicide resistance, and by doing that, you can reduce rates and reduce your sprays. So one way to manage fungicide resistance is to use resistant varieties, and you don't need to continue to use robust fungicide regimes on those resistant varieties.
Is there a way of judging the effect of a resistant variety against how much fungicide needs to be applied? Is it just a case of monitoring the crop and applying when needed, or what would you say?
You could look at the untreated yields in the recommended list and see what the risk would be if you didn't apply a fungicide. So, for example, KWS Days last year had an untreated yield of 95%. So that meant, on average over the country, obviously no site fits an average, but if you were to admit all fungicides, then your yield would only be 5% lower than what it would be if you applied the belt and braces fungicide regime that the RL trials get. So that's a way that you can, as a starting point, to work out what cost of fungicide you want to be using on that variety. Paul probably has something to add.
No, I think that's a pretty comprehensive answer. I mean, you can use varieties around the farm in different ways. So you might have a very high yielding, potentially high output variety, which is a little more sensitive to disease, which you could perhaps put closer to the farm, where you can keep an eye on it, and you make sure you get your fungicide timings correct. If you've got a parcel of land which perhaps it's being rented, it's some distance away and you don't get to see so often, that's a place to put your more resistant varieties, which can perhaps look after themselves a little bit more. But yeah, starting with a recommended list and those untreated yields is a good place to start.
Great, thank you. And one final question to both of you. What would you say are the main considerations when choosing a variety? Paul, we'll start with you.
Well, I think that really depends on the system you're in. I mean, for some people it will be the market. Are you growing for a specific end market, perhaps a malting barley, a milling wheat, a biscuit wheat, or are you just growing a barn filling feed? It's under a very high intensity system. It's horses for courses, really. Somebody in the west of England just growing a small area to feed to their own stock will be looking for a variety that doesn't need a lot of looking after. You really can't say what are the main considerations. It's very specific to an individual farm, an individual farmer, and that's where the agronomist comes in to work with the farmer to work through those recommended lists tables to find out which variety suits their particular situation.
Yeah, Catherine, would you agree?
Well, obviously, I'd always say disease is the most important. Obviously, it is. But I realise that there's other things apart from disease. And you can actually go too far with just focusing on disease. For example, if you were to only grow varieties with a yellow rust rating of 8 and 9, then that could put pressure on the pathogen population if they're all using the same resistance genes, and possibly increase the speed or likelihood of a variety breaking down to a disease. So, for example, for that particular disease, it's important to grow varieties with a range of resistance ratings. So that's something to think about. But no, I haven't got anything more to add to what Paul said.
Great, thank you. So in the interest of time, I think that brings us to the end of our session. So thank you both very much for presenting this morning and sharing your thoughts on our questions. So I hope you've all found it enjoyable and informative. And on that note, we really appreciate your feedback. So there is, there is a tab just below the video with session feedback. So we would appreciate if you took a few moments just to fill in some quick questions about this session specifically, so that we can continue to improve and make sure these sessions are valuable to you. On the screen now are your unique basis and Neroso codes about B21B and 21B. Notice that you can add up to 8 at one time using the box on the left hand side of your screen. Next will be continuing recommended. This is an agronomy week session, and looking at how the recommended list can be used to minimise risk. The next agronomist induction session will be tomorrow morning at 9 AM, and that will start our potatoes focused sessions. At lunchtime today, there will be some exhibitions by Basis and AIC at lunchtime today. So if you have any questions, please use the chat function, and I believe we're having some sound issues. But thank you for joining us this morning, and I hope you enjoy the rest.
So hi everyone, sorry about those technology issues there. There was a bit of sound quality problems just at the end, so we just wanted to make sure you've got all the information that you need. So the session feedback form is in the session window, so just scroll down. There's 3 short questions that we're just asking you to complete so that we can take your feedback on board and continue to improve what we deliver to you as you progress through your careers. There are Basis and Neroso points available for attending this and all of the live stream webinar sessions throughout the week. So you can see those unique codes on your screen now. Basis code is B21B and the Neroso code is N for Neroso 21B. So you'll be able to find the submission forms for those codes on the online conference platform. So if you just scroll down on the left-hand side there, you'll be able to find them there. The next Agronomy Week webinar is starting in just over half an hour at 11 o'clock. So we're going to look again with Paul and Catherine, and they're joined by some other speakers as well, looking at the recommended list, how we choose varieties on farm to minimise the risk of crop production. So we really hope that you'll be able to join us for that session at 11, and then continue to join us for the rest of the day. So apologies for those sound issues. Thank you to Fiona, thank you to Paul, and thank you to Catherine. Hope you enjoy the rest of the day. Thanks for joining, and goodbye.